Good morning and welcome to this morning's Bristol University. Today we're going to be talking about 6 composers and their lyricists, the birth of the American musical. With us this morning we have Professor James Kolb, a professor of dance and drama here at Hofstra University.
Thank you. Good morning. I've been teaching at Hofstra for 28 years, and I taught at another college 15 years previous to that, so I've had a lot of experience. I've taught the American musical 12 times at a previous college, 4 times here now. I also direct and teach a variety of other courses. So today we're going to look at where the American musical came from. You probably know what's called the Golden Age, which began March 31st, 1943, with the opening night of Oklahoma. That Golden Age included Rodgers and Hammerstein with Oklahoma, Carousel, and so on. Lerner and Lowe, Leonard Bernstein, a number of Julie Stein, a number of other composers. That Golden Age ended around 1964 in December when Fiddler on the Roof opened. After that, the musical began changing. It was no longer the heavy book musical that it had been from 43 to 64. It moved into what was known as the concept musical, 1966 with Cabaret, 1970 with Company. Alec Wilder, a musicologist and musician, wrote a book called American Popular Song, which looks at what's called the American Songbook, and he sees it ending in 1950. And he looks at it from 1900 to 1950, and that's what I'm going to do basically today, starting with a series of composers and the work they did that really began putting American theater on the map, American musical theater. In the 19th century, America was heavily influenced by British drama and music. So we did ballad operas, which were an imitation of the British Beggar's Opera. We did operettas, an imitation not only of the English with Gilbert and Sullivan, but of German operetta as well. 1880s and 1890s were heavily popular with the work of Gilbert and Sullivan, and American composers imitated that. It's not until 1900 and a little after that America began to find its own voice, and that leads us to the first composer I want to discuss. That's George M. Cohan. Okay, George M. Cohan is an unusual case. He's Irish. In the musical theater, most of the composers and lyricists were Jewish. They were outsiders. They were the children, in cases, themselves. Cases, children and grandchildren of immigrants, and as outsiders, they were permitted to work in this area that people did not take very seriously. Cohan, the Irish had been here longer, but he was still Irish, and that made him a bit of an outsider. In 2004, he created Little Johnny Jones, a musical in 3 acts that takes us to England. Johnny Jones is an American jockey who goes to England to race in the Derby. He's expected to win, but he loses. He's accused of cheating on the race. As a result, he has to stay in England while they find proof to determine whether or not he cheated. As he gets there, he celebrates the fact that he's a Yankee Doodle Dandy, one of the best known of Cohan's songs. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle do or die. Well, he dies. He loses the race, and his friends are all heading back to New York on a ship. He has to remain in England until it's clarified whether or not he cheated. He says farewell to his friends on the dock with another song that might be familiar to you. Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me in Herald Square. Thank all the gang on 42nd Street, for I will soon be there. That's 1904, and it begins to have an American vocabulary in the songs. We're no longer trying to construct very elegant poems. Cohan goes on and continues until the 1930s as a performer, a producer. Cohan not only composes the music and writes the songs, he produces and directs the shows, and he stars in them as a singer-dancer. Other songs of his, in addition to Yankee Doodle Dandy and Give My Regards to Broadway, include Life's a Funny Proposition After All, 45 Minutes from Broadway, Mary's a Grand Old Name, Harrigan spells Harrigan, celebrating a previous Irish performer, and a couple of patriotic songs, which was again part of his contribution to making the American musical theater American. You're a Grand Old Flag, and during World War I over there. So Cohan is remembered primarily for one musical, but he's remembered also for a number of popular songs that remain popular to the present. Following him, Irving Berlin was a Jewish immigrant. He came here at the age of 4 from Eastern Russia, escaping a pogrom in the shtetl his parents lived in. He was born in 1888. He got here in 1892 as Israel Ballin. He changed his name because he wanted to sound more American, so he changed it to I. Berlin and then to Irving Berlin. His father died when he was 14. He had several younger brothers and sisters, and as a result, he decided, I really need to leave home so my mother has one less mouth to feed. So at the age of 14, Berlin began working in a Lower East Side saloon, a dive, where he worked as a waiter and then was taught how to be a singing waiter. He learned to play the piano in one key, F sharp major. F sharp major involves all the black keys. That was the only key he ever learned, but he learned how, and he never learned to write music or read music. But nonetheless, he composed more than 1,000 songs and wrote the lyrics for them as well. As early as 1907, he had his first song, Marie from Little Italy, published. In 1910, he composed a musical piece without words called Alexander's Clarinet. In 1911, he was invited to join the Friars, and as becoming a new member of this organization, he had to entertain the Friars at their induction ceremony. So he reworked his 1910 piece in 1911, put words to it, and created his first big hit, Come On Along, Come On Along, Come On Along and Listen to Alexander's Ragtime Band. That put him on the map. It made him money. He got married the next year, 1912. He went to Havana on his honeymoon, and his wife caught typhoid and died 3 months later. That threw him off track initially, but it then deepened the kind of music he wrote. And he went on to write several songs that reflected on this loss of his wife. When I Lost You is one example of that. What'll I Do? All Alone. In 1918, he was drafted into the Army and was stationed out on Long Island at Yaphank, and he said they need a recreation center. So he proposed to the officer in charge, I'm a composer, why don't you let me create a musical that the Army can present on Broadway? And he said, sure, go ahead. And he created Yip Yip Yaphank, a 1918 musical. And one of the most famous songs from it is Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, the lament of every soldier when he hears the bugle waking him up. He had other popular songs in the show. It was supposed to run for 16 performances. It wound up running for 38, and it raised more than enough money to provide for the recreation center at Camp Upton and Yaphank. He, the next year, was out of the Army because the war ended, and was invited by Florence Ziegfeld to compose music for the Ziegfeld Follies 1919 edition. And he created a song that became the leitmotif for all of the later versions of the Follies, called A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody. He also created Mandy for that Follies, danced originally by Marilyn Miller, and You'd Be Surprised for Eddie Cantor. And he created a song, because it was 1919 and Prohibition was about to begin, You Cannot Make Your Shimmy Shake on Tea. He regrets the fact that they're no longer going to have alcohol to loosen themselves up. He went on in the 20s to build a theater with a producer called the Music Box Theater, which is still there on Broadway. And for 4 seasons, he created Music Box Revues with a complete score composed by himself. 1933, he created As Thousands Cheer, a musical review for the Depression that included several hit songs, Easter Parade, We're Having a Heat Wave, Harlem on My Mind, and then one really serious song, Supper Time, about a black woman whose husband has been lynched and she has to prepare a meal for her children. So even in musical entertainment during the Depression, serious songs could be presented. 1942, we're in another war. Irving contacts the military and says, could we do another soldier review? And he reworked Yip Yip Yap Hank. This time it was called This Is the Army. And it included a new song, This Is the Army, Mr. Jones, and I Left My Heart at the Stage Door Canteen. Now, between 1933 and 1942, he was asked to create a song for a radio broadcast on Veterans Day, which was called Armistice Day. And he said, well, yeah, I have a song. He had cut this song from Yip Yip Yank Hank because he thought it was too sentimental. And finally, in 1938, it gets sung, God Bless America. It sat in his drawer for 20 years because Berlin, for all of his talent, never believed he was good enough. In the 1920s, he fell in love with an Irish Catholic girl, Ellen Mackey, the daughter of a very, very wealthy Long Islander, and they eloped 2 years later. They had 3 children. They were married for 62 years. Mr. Mackey initially disliked Irving and said, you know, I have a very long family history, and Irving says, I have a long one, it goes back to Exodus. And Mackey's response was, well, get the hell out of here, make your Exodus. After the Depression, Irving Berlin was worth several $1 million. He did not get hurt by the stock market crash, and he gave Ellen Mackey's father $1 million, and that made them friends. In the late 40s, in the 50s, and even the early 60s, Irving Berlin, whose first song was created in 1907, continued to succeed. In 1946, he created words and music for Annie Get Your Gun. You can't get a man with a gun. There's no business like show business. Another song that he tried to cut because he didn't think it was good enough. They Say It's Wonderful. I Got Lost in His Arms. I Got the Sun in the Morning. Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better. Really an extraordinary score, one of his great musicals. He followed that with a number of other musicals, none of which were quite as successful. His last musical was 1962, celebrating John F. Kennedy in the White House, called Mr. President. Berlin went on to compose another 200 songs after 1962, but he felt at that point he had gone out of date. So he no longer published his songs. So those are the first two who really do shape the American musical and the popular song. We now move to Jerome Kern. Jerome Kern started as early as 1914, died in 1946, but he worked throughout his career. And one of his most successful shows was Leave It to Jane in 1917. It was a year in which there were 4 shows of his presented in the course of one season. Leave It to Jane, 1917, was called a Princess Theater musical. It was done in an intimate 299-seat theater, and it was set on a college campus. It had to do with young boys and girls falling in love and hoping that they would win the big football game. So again, something very topical, something very, very reflective of the Americans and the American change that was occurring in the teens and 20s. Kern went on to compose in 1920 at the request of Florence Ziegfeld. He wanted a show for Marilyn Miller. Kern created Sally. Sally was one of something like 61 musicals created in the 1920s that were based on the Cinderella story. And the humorous part of it is the Prince Charming usually was a banker or a lawyer that a young working girl met and fell in love with, and in at least 60 cases, he came from Long Island, okay, which was the place for princes and men of wealth. One of the songs for Marilyn Miller in Sally was Look for the Silver Lining, another standard in the Kern catalog. 4 years later, he was asked to create another musical for Marilyn Miller, and he created Sunny, and that included Who. His biggest success and a turning point for the American musical in terms of making it a book musical, making the story more important than simply retelling Cinderella. 1926, Edna Ferber published a novel called Showboat. Oscar Hammerstein II, a man who would later work with Richard Rodgers, had been working with a number of composers in the 20s, and he proposed to Jerome Kern that let's make a musical out of Showboat. And it's the first musical that really has a serious content. It involves miscegenation, it involves issues of race and gender, it involves a black man who sings Old Man River, and sings about the fact that the black folks work while the white folks play. It was a very serious musical for 1927, and it had a raft of successful songs. In addition to Old Man River, Make Believe, Can't Help Lovin' That Man, I Might Fall Back on You, Life Upon the Wicked Stage, You Are Love, Why Do I Love You, and Bill. So a remarkable musical that took place between 1880 and 1927. Very unusual for a musical to have to cover 47 years of history, but a greatly successful one. Again, produced by Florence Ziegfeld, and at the time everyone thought it was going to be a failure, that no one was going to be interested in that time period. But it was an extraordinary success, and it showed where Oscar Hammerstein II was going to go in the future. When he partnered with Richard Rodgers in 1942, they developed seriously the book musical that he had first created in 1927 with Showboat. In the 30s, Kern created Roberta, another show that was not well received on the stage but became a successful film, and it includes Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and I'll Be Hard to Handle and Yesterday. As I said, Kern died in 1946, just before he was supposed to start work on Annie Get Your Gun. Rodgers and Hammerstein, who were producing the show, turned to Irving Berlin and asked him if he would replace Jerome Kern. And Berlin said, I don't think I'm talented enough to do that. Well, he turned out to be. In the 1920s, a biography of Irving Berlin was being written, and the writer wrote to Jerome Kern and said, I'm writing a biography of Irving Berlin. What's his place in American music? And Jerome Kern, one of the extraordinary composers, wrote back, Berlin doesn't have a place in American music. He is American music. So the love between and admiration between these composers was significant. And it was a small group of people creating the American musical, and they really respected each other. Moving to our next person, George Gershwin. George Gershwin's career began around 1919, writing for Al Jolson, among others, working with a variety of lyricists. His song for Jolson in 1919 was Swanee, with lyrics by Irving Caesar. In the early 20s, he began composing musical comedies with his brother Ira as lyricist. But Ira felt, my brother is so famous, I don't want to use my name. So Ira Gershwin wrote the lyrics under the name Arthur Francis. He and George's brother was named Arthur. Their sister was named Frances. So he used a pseudonym because he didn't want to ride on his brother's coattails. By 1924, Ira had done enough light verse that had been published in newspapers across the country that he felt now he could show himself for real. So in Lady Be Good, 1924, the lyrics were by Ira Gershwin, the music by his brother George. Lady Be Good included Fascinating Rhythm, half of it Deary Blues. They followed 2 years later with OK in 1926, including Clap Your Hands, Fidgety Feet, and a major hit, Someone to Watch Over Me. 1927, they did Funny Face, Swonderful, Smarvelous, My One and Only, and a number of other songs. 1930, Girl Crazy. This is an important show because it had 5 hit songs, including Bidin' My Time, Embraceable You, But Not For Me, Sam and Delilah, and the show that put Ethel Merman on the map in her very first show, I Got Rhythm, I Got Music, a song that became an anthem for Merman for the rest of her career. But she made her debut on Broadway in 1930 in Girl Crazy, singing that song. 1931, George and Ira decided they wanted to change directions, partly influenced by Showboat, partly influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan. They wanted to do a more important book musical, more satirical, having more content, and so they did Of Thee I Sing, which includes the song Of Thee I Sing, Baby. It was a political satire on being president, running for the presidency. It was satiric to the extreme. Wintergreen runs for president on the claim that he will marry the woman he loves if he is elected. So you have to elect me, otherwise I won't be able to marry the woman I love. He gets into the White House, and the vice president discovers his job is not much of a job, so impeachment proceedings occur to impeach the president. But in the meantime, his wife gives birth to twins, and you can't impeach a president who's just had twins, so that's defeated. So it is a comic depiction in 1931 of the political situation at the time, the end of Herbert Hoover's 4 years as president. They're in the early Depression, and it's a musical that has a very, very wonderful score, but it's making serious points. So it really has content to it and not merely good songs. Wintergreen for President is one of them. Of Thee I Sing, Baby. Love is Sweeping the Country. So really a beautiful score. They went on to do a follow-up satire that wasn't as effective, Let 'Em Eat Cake. But then George decided he wanted to push even further. He and Ira had been in Hollywood for a couple of years, which is where most of the composers went in the 1930s in between work on Broadway, because they were popular. There were a lot of musical films being made, and the New York composers and lyricists were brought out to Hollywood to write the songs for them. But in 1935, they returned to New York, and George, stretching his career even further, decided to write an American, what he called an American folk opera, what we now simply call an opera, Porgy and Bess. And it really was wide-ranging. It involved an entirely African-American cast. There are some debatable questions about it, but it was a very serious opera that was not successful. It ran 135 performances in 1935, which was not much of a run. But Otto Kahn had asked him to do it at the Met, where it would have had 2 or 3 performances and probably have disappeared forever. By taking it to Broadway, he got 135 performances, and it has been revived frequently ever since. In the early 1950s, it was revived with William Warfield and Leontine Price at the very beginning of their career, and it put them on the map. That was toured to La Scala in Milan, to Russia, taken all over Europe as an example of American art. And Leontine Price and William Warfield, as a result of working together as Porgy and Bess, married, and they both went on, Leontine Price much more of a career than William Warfield, but they both went on to have careers in the world of opera. So George Gershwin died 2 years later in 1937 at the age of 38. One wonders where he might have gone had he not died so young. Whenever I talk about Gershwin, I always say that, most great composers don't hit their stride until the age of 40. Look what George Gershwin accompanied at the age of 38. If Bernstein didn't make it to 40, we wouldn't have had West Side Story. If Rodgers didn't make it to 40, we wouldn't have had Oklahoma. If Cole Porter didn't make it to 40, we wouldn't have Kiss Me Kate. If Sondheim didn't make it to 40, we wouldn't have Company, never mind any of the later Sondheim musicals. So the lesson is there, and most of the other composers, they don't hit their stride until 40. Gershwin was just beginning to hit his stride in 1935 with Porgy, died sadly 2 years later. I just mentioned Richard Rodgers as one of the people who thankfully survived beyond age 40. His career started as early as 1919. His last work was in 1979, the year in which he died. So he had a career that spanned 60 years. Now, Stephen Sondheim in interviews has said, well, a musical theater career is about 25 years. After that point, one is out of fashion. Well, Irving Berlin showed that you could stay in fashion longer than 25 years. Richard Rodgers did as well. Rodgers started in 1919, but did not have his first real success until 1925. And his partner at that time was Lorenz Larry Hart. He was the only person Larry Hart worked with, Richard Rodgers. And in 1925, they put together a revue that was scheduled to be performed one Sunday evening at the Garrick Theater. It was a theater guild theater, and the young members of the Theater Guild Company agreed to participate in this evening revue called the Garrick Gaieties. Well, it produced one hit song, which Richard Rodgers was conducting, and he said he got chill on the back of his neck as the audience responded to the song. The song was Manhattan. I'll take Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island too. A wonderful topical song referring to New York City. Now, the audience in the 1920s on Broadway was about 80% local. It was not the tourist audience it is now. So this audience came from the 5 boroughs. These were their homes. Television didn't exist. Film existed, but only in silent form. So theater and radio was just in its infancy. So theater was their main form of entertainment. And they turned out in such numbers that the show that was supposed to run one night wound up running for 125 Sunday nights. They then did Garrick Gaieties of 1926 and included another hit song, Mountain Greenery. So their career was launched. They worked throughout the 1930s and worked more and more in the book format. What they had learned from Showboat, what they were learning from what George and Ira Gershwin were doing, they followed. So in 1935, they did a musical at the Hippodrome, a theater that seated 5,200 people, and it involved not only a musical, but a circus, literally. The musical was called Jumbo, and it involved elephants and other acts in addition to a love story. And the love story included songs like Over and Over Again, what it means to be a circus performer or an actor. One has to repeat over and over again. It also included Little Girl Blue, My Romance, and The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. Jimmy Durante sang The Most Beautiful Girl in the World in 1935. He sang it again in 1962 when they made a film of Jumbo. Next year, On Your Toes was created, 1936. It showed the quality of the anti-love song that was characteristic of Larry Hart's work with Richard Rodgers. Richard Rodgers wrote mostly in a waltz tempo. When he worked later with Oscar Hammerstein II, they created pretty sentimental songs. Larry Hart liked to go against the music. So in On Your Toes song, it's got to be love. It isn't bursitis. Okay? Love is a painful thing. Show also included There's a Small Hotel, the title song On Your Toes, and they went a step further. Oklahoma was not the first time that dance played an important part in a musical. In 1936, the musical ended with a ballet called Slaughter on 10th Avenue, which one can still see because it was choreographed by George Balanchine, who at the time had a school but did not yet have a company. New York City Ballet became his company, and Slaughter on 10th Avenue remains in the repertory of New York City Ballet. But it was created for a Broadway musical and intended to tell part of the story about a group of dancers working both on Broadway and in other forms. 1937, Babes in Arms. Songs included Where or When, Babes in Arms, I Wish I Were in Love Again, My Funny Valentine, The Lady is a Tramp. Not a bad set of popular songs to come from one musical. And again, it was a musical that had content. It was about young children living on Long Island whose parents were vaudevillians. And the children had to find some way to pass the summer while their parents were out performing. So they create their own theater in a barn and present a vaudeville show just like Mommy and Daddy do. That was relevant in the 1930s. Vaudeville had disappeared, but the audience would still have remembered vaudeville. 1938, just to keep the record going, The Boys from Syracuse. The first time a Broadway musical was based on the work of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is a source material. It involves twins, 2 sets of twins, and it involves songs, again, that show anti-love interests. Falling in love with love is falling for make-believe. This can't be love. It feels too good. Okay, Larry Hart at his best, working against the grain, working against the pretty melodies by bringing in lyrics that suggested this is not the greatest thing in the world, love. Larry Hart never married. He was a very sad solo man. Another song from Boys from Syracuse, Sing for Your Supper. 1940, they hit a peak which anticipates Oklahoma. It was a musical, a really dark, nasty musical called Pal Joey. It was set in Chicago. It was an elderly woman who was married who took a young man as her lover and gave him a nightclub to run. It included I Could Write a Book. Most famously, the older woman sings Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, No More. And she talks about his lover in pretty raw language, which gets cut from most commercial versions. Horizontally speaking, he's at his very best. And they have a naughty little place they go to make love. Ultimately, he betrays her, he falls in love with another woman, and she cuts him off. So it has a dark quality to it. It does not have a happy ending. So Rodgers and Hart carry on from what Kern and Hammerstein did with Showboat. Now, Richard Rodgers, in 1942, was asked to write a musical based on a cowboy story, Green Grow the Lilacs. And Larry Hart looked at it and said, I don't want to work on any damn cowboy musical. So Rodgers said, would you prefer I get another partner to do it? And Rodgers said, go ahead. And so he turned to Oscar Hammerstein II, and they began a partnership that would last from 1943 until 1959. That began with Oklahoma. Now, Agnes DeMille, who did the choreography, didn't believe it was going to succeed. Agnes DeMille had tickets, mezzanine tickets for opening night. She did not give them to friends because she was embarrassed at what was going to happen. Oklahoma opened to a less than full house. The next day there was a line around the block, people demanding to get tickets to it. Oklahoma ran the longest musical at the time, 2,212 performances. It ran into 1950, and it then was in several national tours for years after that. So Rodgers and Hammerstein took what began with Showboat in 1927, what Rodgers had worked on in things like Boys from Syracuse and Pal Joey, and they took it to a new level. Dance had been used to tell part of the story previously, but not as effectively as in this show. 2 years later, 1945, they create Carousel. 2 years after that, they have a failure. Even the giants have failures. They did Allegro, which did not work. 2 years later, 1949, they have their second longest running musical after Oklahoma, South Pacific. Another very, very significant story dealing with racial issues. A man from a wealthy Philadelphia family falls in love with a Polynesian woman. And he sings, you've got to be taught, carefully taught, okay, who to look at and who to fear. Nellie Forbush, a woman from Arkansas, falls in love with a Frenchman who has had an affair and 2 children with a Polynesian woman. Again, a difficulty between them. This is 1949, and it's dealing with racial and ethnic issues. And you've got to be carefully taught. The producers wanted cut from the show. They felt it was just too serious. Rodgers and Hammerstein refused. So they go on to do King and I in 51. They end their career in 1959 with The Sound of Music. They did just 9 musicals, 1 musical for television, which is on Broadway right now, Cinderella, and 1 film musical, State Fair. A relatively small, modest number compared to the 29 musicals that Rodgers had done with Larry Hart, but they really created the book musical that influenced all of the other composers working around them, Lenny Bernstein, Compton and Green, Lerner and Lowe, Frank Lesser. Guys and Dolls wouldn't have happened had it not been for this development of the book musical. So Richard Rodgers probably is the giant among giants, but that's hard to say when we have Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern having done what they did. So let's move now to the last of the six composers, because he was working in the 1920s, but his first success did not come until 1929, and that's Cole Porter. Cole Porter, unlike Berlin, Kern, Rodgers, Hart, was not Jewish. He came from Peru, Indiana, and he once was talking to Richard Rodgers and said, "I've just discovered how to write Jewish music." And Rodgers said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "He showed me this song, and he'd written it in a minor key." But Porter felt like an outsider. He was born in the Midwest. He came from a wealthy family, very different. Richard Rodgers' father was a medical doctor, but most of these families grew up in poverty. Peru came with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was a graduate of Yale and Harvard, where his grandfather paid for his schooling with the hope that he would become a doctor or a lawyer. But at Yale, Porter got interested in music. He wrote Eli and other fight songs that are still sung at Yale football games, and discovered, and his grandfather finally accepted the fact, that his career was going to be in music. He has a decade of not much success. In fact, he goes to Paris in 1918 to drive an ambulance at the end of World War I. He claims he went because he had had such a failure on Broadway that he had to join the army. Well, Cole liked to inflate the facts and play with the facts, and he tells different stories about what inspired him to compose his songs. But by 1929, 1930, he created the New Yorkers, which included a naughty song, Love for Sale. It's the early Depression, prostitutes standing outside a restaurant selling themselves. Take Me Back to Manhattan, Let's Fly Away. He had gotten into trouble in 1929 because he wrote, "Let's do it, let's fall in love. Birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it." The producer said, "No, that's not a good song. You need to replace it with something less naughty." He replaced it with Let's Misbehave, which is equally naughty. So Porter was a gay man in a very happy marriage with a very wealthy woman, and he had his own take on love, not that dissimilar from Larry Hart. Cole Porter wrote his lyrics as well as the music, and he liked to write against the grain. So he has a lot of songs that suggest something negative, not merely positive. He started having success in 1930. His first big success came in 1934 with Anything Goes, a musical that featured Ethel Merman, for whom he would write 4 other musicals in the course of his career. This was her first one with him. I Get a Kick Out of You, You're Better Than Champagne or Cocaine, again, testing the limits. All Through the Night, You're the Top, Anything Goes, which is again a naughty song. You know, we write books now with 4-letter words. We go to nudist parties in Hollywood. He's testing the edge of what's permissible in the Broadway musical. Blow, Gabriel, Blow, a wonderful score. Now, he called it his first perfect musical, because what happens to most musicals on the road is you wind up having to rewrite them. You know, I didn't get this right. The producer wants a song here. He thinks someone should have a song there. So you spend a lot of time on the road doing rewrites, writing additional material. Anything Goes opened in previews out of town, and it did not require any changes. So he called that his first perfect musical. A year later, he composed Jubilee, which is not as significant a show, but again includes significant songs. When Love Comes Your Way, Begin the Begin, just one of those things. And he got a letter from Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin had just been in Paris, and Irving wrote to Cole, "I was just in Paris and they were playing Begin the Begin everywhere. It's a wonderful song." And Cole Porter writes back to Irving and says, "But not as good as this or that song of yours. Again, the respect shown among these composers and lyricists was significant. They were really a very small community, and they did respect what each other was doing, although they differed significantly in the way they approached it. 1936, another show for Ethel Merman, Red Hot and Blue, including a song that has been interpolated into most revivals of Anything Goes, It's De Lovely. It was also the title of a film biography of Cole Porter. 1938, he not only writes for Ethel Merman, he introduces Mary Martin in 1938 in Leave It to Me. She's on a railroad station in a snowstorm, and she sings, My Heart Belongs to Daddy. And the daddy she's referring to is a sugar daddy. She's a young girl being kept by an elderly, rich man. So again, testing the limits, but it put Mary Martin on the stage for the first time and made her a star. 1939, another show for Ethel Merman, DuBarry Was a Lady, which included Well, Did You Ever? And Friendship. And the recent Sutton Foster revival of Anything Goes decided there weren't enough hit songs, so they included Friendship in that revival. And that tends to happen with Anything Goes. His popular songs from other shows wind up in it. And then he had, in 1948, another quote-unquote perfect show. And that was inspired by the boys from Syracuse. It was a musical version of Taming of the Shrew called Kiss Me, Kate. And it involved a song, Wunderbar, which is from an operetta that the major couple, who are now divorced, remember having been as early in their career as lovers in, and they sing Wunderbar, which includes things that only Cole Porter knows. Gazing down on the Jungfrau from our secret chalet for two. It's not possible to gaze down on the Jungfrau. It's the highest peak in the region. And Cole had traveled around the world often enough that he knew those little in-jokes. How much of the audience would have got it is a question, but his songs are often playing games, dropping names. He's famous for his list songs. You know, You're the Top, You're the Coliseum, Friendship. There are a number of songs that are a man and woman challenging each other, trying to better each other. Porter didn't finish with Kiss Me, Kate. He went on to do Can Can in 1953, which included C'est Magnifique, Live and Let Live, It's All Right With Me, and I Love Paris. Other songs of his included I've Got You Under My Skin, In the Still of the Night, True Love. He wrote a film song, Be a Clown. He had a long career, and again, like Irving Berlin, like Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart, like George and Ira Gershwin, like Jerome Kern, he worked in Hollywood as well as New York in the 1930s because that was a way of making a living. These are the six that I think really generated the seeds, planted the seeds that led to the golden age of musical theater. What's interesting is there are people I don't have time to mention, like Dietz and Schwartz, who did a series of musical reviews in the 1930s, Harold Arlen, who was a major composer beginning in the 1930s, Julie Stein, who comes a little bit later. There are probably in all about 26 to 28 significant composers of the American musical. But these six, I think, really did start, and as I say, planted the seeds for what would become a great American art form. And one of the few American art forms that has really had impact overseas. London is crazy for American musicals and has been since the 1920s. Places like the State's Opera, the Vienna State Theater will do West Side Story. Theaters around the world have done Porgy and Bess and Showboat. So what became, or started as a simple little American thing, has really gone around the world. So that pretty much concludes me in terms of this presentation. I'm sorry we don't have time to play songs. I think that would have made it interesting, but go to questions.
All right, thank you so much. So now we're going to begin the resident questions. So after I say your location, just come back to us with your question. Lynn Brooke, do you have a question?
Yes, it seems like most of the famous composers came from so many years ago. Who would you consider to be one of famous composers today, if they still exist?
I'm not sure they still exist. We have a significant number of young composers. Most of them work off-Broadway. Adam Gittell is one who comes to mind. He's the grandson of Richard Rodgers, but his career has pretty much been limited to off-Broadway. The cost of putting a musical on Broadway today is so prohibitive. Never mind Spider-Man at $75 million, but a more conventional musical is still going to cost 18 to 20 million. And you can't fail. And Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Kern, they all failed. They all had failures, and that was part of the learning process. But it's too expensive now to fail. So who are the last of the great composers? I think Stephen Sondheim really is, and Jerry Herman was a very, very popular composer into the 1990s. Stephen Sondheim into the 1990s, but we really don't have, I mean, we have some good composers and lyricists at the moment, but I don't think they're going to have the staying power of that previous generation because the economics no longer permit it.
Thank you. Massapequa, do you have a question?
Do you think that the music community is too big now to ever have another golden age in the future?
Well, what I've said before is ragtime was considered naughty music, and then jazz was considered naughty music. I think some of the new musical styles, we had the naughty music of rock, Shape Hair. We've had Rent in the 1990s use contemporary music, so I think that's still possible. And I think there have been a few recent works that have taken advantage of pop music, but aiming at a different audience. And I don't think it's as large an audience as it was in the past. We have to, with the internet and texting and iPads, we just have too many different things to draw our attention. The golden age, I think, was an age in which, even though film was competing with it, people still were serious about the theater.
Thank you. New Jersey, do you have a question?
Yes, we have two actually. Our first question was Cole Porter a womanizer? And our second question is, who composed the score for My Fair Lady?
Okay. My Fair Lady was composed by Lerner and Lowe, Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Lowe. Their career did not begin until 1948, which was why I did not include them as six of the founders. Cole Porter was not a womanizer. He was gay. And he did at one point, his wife threatened divorce because he came back, he liked rough sex, and he came back from picking up sailors beaten up. He had a tragic accident in 1937 when he was riding a horse on Long Island. The horse leapt, fell on him, and crushed his legs. He continued to have a success as a composer, but he was on crutches and lost one of his legs in the 1950s. But no, he was never a womanizer.
Thank you. North Hills, do you have a question?
Our question is, what do you think of the new musicals that are based on people's albums, like Carole King and Billy Joel? And do you think they're being used because there aren't enough writers to write original stuff for Broadway, and therefore the American songbook is lacking nowadays?
Well, I think the American songbook may not be lacking, but it certainly has changed. Jersey Boys is a very, very successful use of previous material, as was Smokey Joe's Cafe, so that form can work. It's called the jukebox musical, Mamma Mia being a book-related example of that. The success of those can vary. Roundabout Theater a few years ago did a Burt Bacharach revival that really none of the songs sounded like they were written by Burt Bacharach. They distorted them so much. However, New York Theater Workshop has created Burt Bacharach Reviewed, and it's wonderful. And they've just extended the run for like a third or fourth time. Why do we do this? Well, it's music that's accessible to a broad range of audience, and if you can make it effective on stage, you can get an audience. The other big change is the Disneyfication of Broadway, the idea of taking a musical film like Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, and so on, and restaging it as a musical show. That's not exactly reinventing the wheel. It might be redoing the wheel, as Julie Taymor did with Lion King, but to some extent it's basically children and their parents coming to see what they've already seen as a film. And in that regard, we have changed significantly from the invention of the past.
All right, North Woodmere, do you have a question?
Yeah. Did Cole Porter write Night and Day?
Yes, he did.
And last but not least, White Plains, do you have a question?
Hi, yes. A lot of our questions were answered. However, we have one more. Hoagy Carmichael, one of the residents, wanted to know where he fit in with some of these great composers.
Hoagy Carmichael certainly has a role to play in the 1930s. The reason he's not included here is because he was basically a composer of songs that were abstract pieces, as opposed more of a Tin Pan Alley approach than what we call Schubert Alley, people who wrote for the stage, who wrote songs that had a personal, a political, a social context. Carmichael wrote great music, but it was written really in a different vein. And he's not alone. There are other composers who never really worked in the theater or film. Doesn't lessen them, it's just a different track.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us for Bristol U this morning, and we hope to see you next time. And thank you to Professor Kolb for coming in to talk to us. I hope you all have a great day.